Just say in one or two brief words how delighted we are to have our good friend Homi of the Institute and a great supporter of our group. As you know from the program, the Rothenberg Professor of the Humanities in English and also Comparative Literature has just now stepped down from a long and extremely distinguished tenure as really not just running, but the soul of the Mahindra Humanities Institute, whose budget increased something like tenfold and activity something like 1,000-fold. We all know his work. I think just very briefly to say that the location of culture can very simply be defined as something that's been disputed, but it's really wherever Homi is location of culture and whatever he is working on. That doesn't simplify things so much because you really need an up-to-date GPS to know where Homi is. He has very kindly made time to come here in between his return from Buenos Aires yesterday and his departure for Bombay tonight. So without further ado.
Remarkable set of events that my colleague and friend and comrade David Damrosch has organized over the years. Here is where the resonance of this great project reach. So my dear David has asked me to do a keynote here on each occasion, on each occasion on which the summer school has been held at Harvard. So either I have done reasonably well or he's terribly wrong. You'll have to find out. Whose house is this? Whose house is this? Whose night keeps out the light in here? Say who owns this house. It's not mine. I had another, sweeter, brighter, with a view of lakes crossed in painted boats, of fields wide as arms open for me. This house is strange. Its shadows lie. Say, tell me, why does its lock fit my key? This is from a lyric written by Toni Morrison, set to music by André Perrin. And I want to begin with it because I want to dedicate this lecture to David Damrosch, my friend, my colleague, and the inspiration behind this great event. And I know how deeply interested he is in music, and I also know how deeply he is interested in the whole question of displacement, refugees, exilic writers, emigre diarists, and this work of Toni Morrison's, Whose House Is This?, is, I believe, speaks to his spirit. So David, thank you, and I want to honor you. Toni Morrison's atonal lyric, with its chromatic wandering between notes, represents the music's reluctance to resolve or to be resolved to a home note. The music stalks the lyric with cadences of custom and familiarity, and then its anxious tones and soaring scales fail to provide any sign of return or repose. This dark house of the nation's history, it is as if it's saying, it's not mine. It has dispossessed me and discriminated against me. It has unhomed my history and darkened my presence. I am untouchable. I am enslaved. I am trafficked. I am lynched. This house is strange. And yet, say, tell me, why does its lock fit my key? This evening I turn my attention to problems that arise in the philology and phenomenology of the crises of distressed migration and dignity in extremis. I dwell on despair, but I am not blind to repair. And yet, say, tell me, why does its lock fit my key? My thoughts on migration are informed by disappointed hope, in the manner of Ernest Bloch's belief that hope will be disappointed because it does not aspire to a simple-minded sense of a future of fulfillment, a utopian future. For Bloch, like his melancholic friend Theodor Adorno, political hope is proleptic. It is an anticipatory aspiration, a hope that appeals to a future that is virtual, as yet to come. And yet, what is virtual is also vital to the ways in which we conduct ourselves ethically, politically, and aesthetically in relation to the passage, the transition of a living history. Disappointed hope, Bloch proposes, and I quote, is open in a forward direction, in a future-oriented direction, but it does not address itself to that which already exists. For this reason, hope, while actually in a state of suspension, is committed to change rather than repetition, and what is more, incorporates the element of chance, without which there can be nothing new. And it is this notion of disappointed hope and the question of chance and risk that I'm writing about in more extended ways at the moment. The distressed dignity that stirs in the disappointed hope of the crises of migration is everywhere evident in the testimony of refugees, or indeed distressed migrations, whose lives are suspended between determination and degradation, adjourned between the element of chance and the commitment to change. In the words of Nizam, an Iraqi refugee waiting in a detention facility in Rome, you can hear something of the living notes of disappointed hope as an anxiety, no longer only a theory. In a paradoxical mixture of fearfulness and paranoia, anxiety about what's to come, but the simultaneous confidence that it's hardly worse than what's come before, Nizam is running through possible scenarios in his head, making a run for it, getting caught, having to try again, but he also remembers what he is running from in the same place. Compulsory conscription, the advance of ISIS. The experience of wandering with no let-out clause through a wild and unknown continent, increasingly defined by radicalism at both ends, the dwindling of solidarity between European states, and the scapegoating of refugees and persecuted minorities, starts for him to mirror the 1930s. Taking my cue from the mirror of the 1930s, I begin by looking in a glass darkly to catch reflections of our own moment of the persecution of refugees and minorities. Hannah Arendt's description of barbaric or tribal nationalism of the years between the world wars, particularly intensified around the 1930s, will provide my entry into the barbaric nationalisms of our own times. I will then draw the shadows of these Arendtian reflections into the realm of the Mediterranean migrations, particularly on the Tunisian coast, to think about the problem of human rights from the perspective of human deaths. Finally, I will end with a very brief coda that both celebrates and commiserates with the spirit of disappointed hope. My migratory talk proceeds in 3 movements, titled as follows: the first, Going Full Animal; the second, The Rubbish Dumps of Zarsis; and the third, the brief coda, How Little They Know, Those Now Complicit with the Loss of Life. First, Going Full Animal. The tribal nationalisms that arise amidst our much vaunted global age make it daily clearer how great a burden mankind, the collective human figure of rights and representations, has become for the barbarisms at our gates. The phalanx of male leaders that straddle the world today, Trump, Modi, Maduro, Bolsonaro, Duterte, Putin, Netanyahu, Salvini, Orban, and Xi, are not politicians of charisma. They are politicians of miasma. In the United States, And more recently, in Brazil, England, India, and Italy, Hungary, Poland, and elsewhere, Steve Bannon has become the prime proponent of a nationalist barbarism, which I think he calls the League. And this is not my language. It is Bannon's avowed self-description. In a 2018 interview with The Economist, Bannon proudly assumes the mantle of barbarism. Speaking of the 2016 US elections, he describes his ideological mission with a passion. The country was thirsting for change, and Barack Obama didn't give them enough. I said, we're going for a nationalist message. We are going to go barbarian, and we will win. On March the 25th, 2019, after the publication of the redacted Mueller report, Bannon reinforced his earlier message to Trump to go barbarian and goaded him on to go full animal, in his words. Discrimination and degradation are two faces of the coin of barbaric nationalism that circulate freely and ferociously in their attack on refugees, migrants, minorities, dissidents, whether they are in flight or at home. Discrimination is in large part seen to be institutional and systemic. It is often associated with a vacuum or violation of rights, and the popular presumption is that discrimination can be overcome by the mobilization of some form of legal or quasi-legal action. Degradation bears a relation to discrimination, but it must be recognized for its distinctiveness. We cannot simply read them together. Degradation is a discourse of violent disrespect and humiliation that results in social exclusion, the defamation of cultural personality, and indeed the misrecognition of human relationality. Discrimination resorts to institutional and administrative powers of inequality and injustice in order to establish divisions, separations, hierarchies, and exclusions. Degradation deploys languages that are projective, phantasmatic, imagistic, to mobilize social affects that are instinctively exterminatory, even though they may not in fact resort to such extremities. The language of discrimination, of degradation, I apologize. The language of discrimination has a kind of progressive narrative, possible progressive narrative. Degradation, I feel, and I will argue, is fundamentally exterminatory. There is something genocidal about or within the language of degradation. Degradation, as I conceive it, bears a family resemblance to what the philosopher Avishai Margalit has identified as the key concept for humiliation. It is its rejection from the human commonwealth, and it consists of behaving as if the person were an object. Such rejection typically consists in treating humans as subhumans or outside the pale of humanity. I think we now better understand the care with which Bannon chooses his words, inciting Trump to go animal against his enemies, Democrats, dissidents, minorities, migrants, refugees, and no insult to animals. I think you get the tropic nature of what I'm saying. That there is a way in which the language of degradation, in my view, is about extermination. It's not only about exclusion. I'm not saying, therefore, that it necessarily leads to genocide or that is the intention, but I genuinely believe that it's extermination that is at really, as a category, that is at risk. Discrimination relies on a biopolitics of calculation and quantification to make its case against minorities or indeed in favor of a legal recourse to equality, quotas, data, statistics, numbers, ratios. Degradation emerges from a biopolitics of violent and vindicatory affect, anxiety, fear, death. You can optimistically imagine an institutional end to discrimination, but there can be no formal closure to the informal and ubiquitous indignity of degradation. And here, just very briefly, I expand this in relation to a reading of the end of Foucault's Society Must Be Protected. Because at that moment, at the end of the book, if you remember, there is a certain uneasiness about how the notion of the biopolitical enters into the notion of disciplinary power. Is it a transition? Is it not a transition? Is it a palimpsest? He goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And the pivot of that argument, I believe, is his discussion about the way in which the unresolved problem there is the problem of death and extermination. So biopolitics, which is about the politics of life, has this undertow of death. And he says where there is death, the whole system lists towards death. And even more interestingly, he said, but where did death come to? How does it enter the realm of biopolitics? And rather in an Arendtian way, he says, it comes from the imperial past. But he doesn't work this out. And in the book, I work this out. Just like Arendt in the Origins of Totalitarianism talks about the fact that the genocidal, exterminatory destiny of Western institutions post-30s comes from the fact that, she says, the imperial boomerang, that's her word, the imperial boomerang goes into effect. The larger idea being that imperial progress is, of course, deeply questionable, because she says, however many gifts you offer the people who you dominate, you can never get their consent. Funnily enough, it's rather like Ranajit Guha's idea of domination without hegemony. It's that kind of idea, I think, that really needs to be explored in relation to what we call biopolitics today, and that's part of the project that I'm involved in. The ambivalence of Foucault to this whole question. The populist slogans, make America great again, make India Hindu again, make Britain Brexit again, are rhetorical instances of the barbarisms of tribal nationalism. The traditional tendency is to associate the adjective great with populist chauvinism and the neoliberal hauteur of global capitalism. More lethal by far, in my view, is the rebarbative iteration of the adverb again. If great refers to majoritarian sovereignty and the possibility of nationalist-populist alliances, again references a revanchist temporality of degradation that goes full animal by legitimating a mythical, atavistic return to a state of ethnic or racial purity, or a closed-in cultural homogeneity, a walled-in security of territorial sovereignty. The devil is in the details, and the adverb, again, is, in my view, decidedly the devil. Again, as an affective appeal to barbaric nationalism is what Freud has described as the screen memory. Although Freud's interest in the afterlife of memory traces relates to childhood memories, screen memories as theoretical constructs deal more generally with an exclusionary, even exterminatory fantasy of the retrieval and reconstruction of the national past, which is to be brought to life again. Simple inaccuracy of reflection does not play any considerable part here, Freud explains. Close investigation shows rather that these falsifications of memory are tendentious, that is, they serve the purposes of repression and replacement, and a number of motives with no concern for historical accuracy had a part in forming them, as well as in the selection of these memories themselves, which, rather like the word again and again and again, have a way of referring to a non-specific past, which is always somehow under threat, whatever the nature of it is. Screen memories serve the purposes of repression and replacement that makes them very different from the representation of the historical archives of First Nations peoples or the pre-colonial histories of colonized people, which are acts of recognition, not repression. They're attempts to establish lost records and make visible lost histories. The invocation of again as a nationalist screen memory plays a tendentious role in attempting to replace the historical achievements of intercultural developments and to repress the right of minoritarian agents within the public sphere. The hegemonic greatness of the nation can only be achieved again and again through the persecutory and peremptory acts of rough justice that are themselves contrary to the spirit of the law. And indeed, when we know and hear the failed promise of never again, never again, never again, I suggest we should listen to the again of making things great again. It's a different scale, but there is a scalar resonance. Imagine this scene at the Migrant Processing Center in the Rio Grande Valley on the South Texas-Mexico border, April 2019. See it first through the eyes of a Border Patrol agent, Christopher Cabrera, who describes the migrant center as infested with scabies, chickenpox, tuberculosis, infectious diseases, you name it, it's possibly been through that building. It's dangerous for our agents. It's dangerous for our detainees that actually don't have anything at all. Asylum seekers who cross the border legally in compliance with the 1951 Refugee Convention and its incorporation into the US Refugee Act of 1980 are, in a reversal of justice, deemed to be illegals. Protections enshrined in the Constitution are violated. Congress and the courts block through the president's executive action. Unaccompanied children are deported. In the year ending September 2018, over 75% of the 100,000 asylum seekers from Central America were able to convince officials of their, and I use a phrase you know well-founded fear of persecution, the litmus test of the Refugee Convention, 1951. At which point, the Trump administration responds by vowing to drastically reduce that rate by making standards tougher. The system is on fire, exclaims yet another official, and now it becomes abundantly clear that the so-called protection of the vigilant security state renders the lives of migrants, the poor, and the racialized increasingly less safe and less secure the more the security apparatus seems to work. In fact, reports the New York Times, the migrants are mostly victims of the broken immigration system. They are not by and large killers, rapists, or gang members. Most do not carry drugs. They have learned how to make asylum claims just as the law allows them to do. The language we frequently use to discuss the injustices of the immigration system around the world is spatial. Borders, frontiers, walls, cells, detention centers are carceral jurisdictions of surveillance. At work within these terms of sovereign territoriality is a migrant or refugee temporality that is often extrajudicial, arising from executive orders and states of exception. Such violations of rights, as I have just argued, are articulated in temporalities of regulation, slowing down, detaining, arresting, expelling, waiting, that reveal time to be as effective and exigent an instrument of immigration injustice as spatial. A refugee is someone who has already arrived somewhere in a foreign land but must wait for an indefinite time before actually having fully arrived, writes Valeria Luiselli in her border novel Lost Children Archive. And I continue, they wait in detention centers, shelters, or camps, in federal custody and under the gaze of armed officials. They wait for the court's notice to appear. They wait for a court's ruling for either deportation or asylum, wait to know where they will end up living and under what conditions. Barbaric nationalism is therefore neither law-abiding nor is it necessarily compliant with the Constitution. The reasonable writ of the law is replaced by the rampant rhetoric of fear and degradation, underwritten by existential uncertainties initiated by agency regulations. In my view, rightlessness is not a simple negation of rights. It creates an ambiguous, vulnerable condition of the perplexity of rights. The perplexity of rights that afflicts distressed migration creates a world in which, to quote Hannah Arendt, although everyone seems to agree that the plight of these people consists precisely in the loss of the rights of man, no one seems to know which rights they lost when they lost these human rights. What is unprecedented is not the loss of a home, but the impossibility of finding a new one. Suddenly, she says, there was no place on earth where migrants could go without the severest restrictions, no territories where they could found a new community of their own. And I particularly like this notion of the perplexity of rights as very much reflecting the moments we're in today, because as you know, the usual reading of Arendt is that, and I think Rossier reads her in this way, and I think it's both true but also a reductive simplification, that for her the only rights are really citizenship rights. And if you lose the rights as a citizen, your human rights count for nothing. But to me, the issue of the perplexity of rights, the way in which there is a continual interstitial interference between what we recognize as a human natural right and what we recognize as a citizenship right, and the ways in which these things become blurred, intercalcated, uncertain, is very much more true to the nature of the problem, at least as I see it now. The tortuous anxiety of waiting is an ethical and phenomenological condition that pivots on the well-founded fear of persecution, Refugee Convention 1951, absolutely central, the litmus test of the Refugee Convention. Although there are different states of rightlessness, distress migration covers a wide range of conditions of displacement, from climate change of refugees to political asylees. To return to Louisella's formulation, the litmus test of the well-founded fear of persecution, in my view, falls right in between having arrived somewhere in a foreign land, as she puts it, and the trial of waiting for an indefinite time before actually having fully arrived. Of course, there's an irony in talking about waiting for an indefinite amount of time. The Refugee Convention, in my reading, has two aspects to it. A jurisdictional territorial aspect that requires the refugee to cross an international border in order to claim asylum. That's the first part of the story. The second part is a jurisprudential temporal aspect that requires the refugee not only to spatially, jurisdictionally to cross the boundary, but on doing so, to construct a narrative that establishes the veracity of the well-founded fear of persecution. So there are these two moments. One is the more spatial moment. The other is the jurisprudential or the temporal moment, the narrative moment. And when they both come together very often, there is a deep undecidability. Again, in the book, I elaborate this at some length, saying that this is rather like the tangled temporalities that Benjamin reads in Proust. It's the same kind of temporal issue. This is where I think humanists have a role to play in these legal issues, as I hope I'm trying to develop. I'm not a lawyer, and narrative is more my deal, but increasingly I find I'm drawn across these disciplines. The former is the moment of political displacement, the crossing of the international boundary without which you cannot claim to be an asylum. The latter, the narrative or jurisprudential moment, is the moment of discretion based on the authority's narrative and interpretational judgments. So one is about displacement. The other, I want to say, is more about narrative discretion. And discretion is where the perplexity of rights plays, because so much of this depends on discretion, on whether you are convinced that there is a well-founded fear of persecution. You don't necessarily have to experience that persecution or had experienced it, but somebody like you or somebody whose circumstances are similar had experienced it, and that's not the only problem. But the well-founded fear of persecution is always in a futurity. It's always proleptic, that sometime in the future you may experience it. You see the complexity of time and verification, time and narrative, time and justification, justification and justice. It's a very deeply complex issue. Louise novel is, and for the law, the way this is resolved by, say, great authorities like Goodwin Gill, is that's why we go for a casuistic case-by-case approach. But I'm suggesting it's not simply the case-by-case approach. I'm suggesting that the very system itself, the very structure, the very regulatory apparatus is deeply complex and in its own way compromised. Louise novel is inscribed on the board, and this is actually written for you, David, because you said, can you say a little bit more about Louise novel? I can only say, I can only give you half a page and catch my plane, but that half page is particularly for you. And I thought about it coming back from Buenos Aires yesterday, and I think I found a way of linking it to this fear of persecution. Louise novel is inscribed on the borderline between political injustice and poetic justice as it explores the legal principle of a well-founded fear of persecution, which relates to the undocumented experience of migrants and refugee children from the perspective of literature's ability to document and narrate the domestic fears of Louise own children within the nuclear family. The book is, for those who don't know it, there are two montage narratives. There is her desire to, she's a journalist, she's worked with children, undocumented children, disappeared children, lost children. So part of it is about that whole narrative. But the narrative is being spoken in a kind of intimate montage with driving through America to go to do her research in New Mexico, and having with her the children who are continually articulating their own fears, their own anxieties about a parental relationship which is breaking up, about a home which is being left behind. So in my view now, I've tried to work it out, David, that the book is based on the domestication, in a way, of the concept of fear of persecution. And the question is, if you cannot assuage the fears of your children, and you cannot sometimes narrate them, what happens when displaced children are put in a cabin and are asked questions? How can they articulate the fear of persecution when your own protected children also feel persecuted in different ways? I'm summarizing this. I hope I've made it clear, because I can't go into it in any great detail. Following the well-trodden traditions of the American on-the-road novels, Louise uproots her children from their home in New York to accompany her on a trip to the borderlands of New Mexico and Arizona to document the carceral conditions of child refugees. A child refugee, she tells her daughter, is someone who waits. In a brilliant montage of the detailed record of her domestic life, set violently against the lost archives of displaced and undocumented lives of migrants in distress, Louise compels us to confront the knife-edge questions of the credibility of literary narrative and its veracities in the harshest condition of human survival. I think about other families like us and unlike us, traveling towards a future impossible to envision the threats and dangers it possesses. What would we do if one of us simply disappeared? And against the background of disappearance, displacement, and being both literally and legally undocumented, arise urgent questions about the very nature of the demand to narrate the psychic affect of the fear of persecution in the instrumental language of administrative regulation and reason. But how many children are sent back, Luiselli asks, without even being given a chance to voice their credible or incredible fears? That's in a way where the issue is. Fear emerges in the incredible. To make it credible is already a practice of a certain repression. To make it credible in a way in which it is codifiable within the instrumental and administrative bureaucratic logic is yet another problem. I've only brought you problems today. And we may now well ask, how do we exercise the right to narrate? The right to narrate, the right to have rights in conditions when the right to movement is caught up in the flux of the perplexity of rights, when no one seems to know, as Arendt puts it, which rights they lost when they lost their human rights. Valeria Luiselli and Hannah Arendt, at a distance of over half a century from each other, are, I believe, on the same page. The jurisdiction of barbaric populist nationalism is a psychic fantasy of a no man's land, itself a kind of borderline condition, a paranoid political projection of an endangered territory surrounded by a barbaric periphery. Arendt writes, politically speaking, tribal nationalism always insists that its own people is surrounded by a world of enemies, one against all, that a fundamental difference exists between this people and all others. It claims its people to be unique, individual, incompatible with all others, and denies theoretically the very possibility of a common mankind long before it is used to destroy the humanity of men and women. Nizam's state of disappointed hope with which I began, a paradoxical mixture of fearlessness and paranoia, anxiety about what's to come, but the simultaneous confidence that it's hardly worse than what came before, is at the heart of the perplexity of rights as I understand it. Arendt famously writes, we became aware of the existence of a right to have rights, and that means to live in a framework when one is judged by one's actions and opinions, and a right to belong to some kind of organized community, only when millions of people emerged who had lost and could not regain these rights because of the new global political situation. If we have time, and I don't know, there's an interesting way in which both Adorno and Arendt talk about the global. Very different from what we understand today as the global, but happy to talk about it if we have time. To speak and think from the standpoint of somebody else, and you will remember this is what Arendt says Eichmann could never do. It wasn't that he simply told lies or covered up his case. He couldn't speak and think from the point of somebody else. And that is, I believe, at the basis of Arendt's idea as she enunciates it in The Right to Have Rights. And it straddles both the moral claim to social membership, human rights, as well as its specific juridico-civil entitlements, citizenship rights. And it is this double articulation of human and civil rights that converges in the creation of what Arendt beautifully calls the human condition. The human condition, which consists of the living relationship between consciousness and moral conscience, between epistemology and ethics, is based on the recognition of alterity in Arendt. Alterity or otherness, Arendt argues, is the very origin of speech and action. And it is a process by which, and I quote her, a difference is inserted into my oneness. I'm inevitably two in one. What thinking actualizes in its process is the difference given in consciousness. The motto for this form of enunciation, I believe, may well be to speak in propria persona is always to speak in persona alterius. To recognize the ethics and politics of alterity as a difference inserted into my oneness is not the consensual, assimilationist pluralism of nation-state policies of multiculturalism, however liberal they may be and however sincere they may be. Anxiety and alterity enacted in the insertion is the complex realization that to be ethically engaged with the difference of otherness demands a violent estrangement or displacement of the agential subject to inhabit the position of the two-in-one. In terms of political consciousness or ethical conscience, it is a radical recognition that the subject of rights is caught in a double articulation of perplexity. The subject of rights occupies an in-between position between the moral claims to social membership and the juridico-civil entitlements of citizenship. So I'm doing something quite unorthodox here, something that is, I'm inserting something into Arendt's two-in-one, which she doesn't herself do, which is to think of the right to have rights as it were constructed on the perplexity of rights. Right? I'm making a kind of a hybrid articulation here. And I'm suggesting, therefore, that the claims of political agency articulated in alterity, a condition of the two-in-one, that what secures the civil rights of citizenship may appear to be that they're always haunted by the insecurity of the loss or denial of the moral claim to citizenship, and vice versa. That these claims of natural rights and human rights and citizenship rights are often in a stage of themselves of a kind of partial perplexity, that they are not so clearly definable even when the law attempts to make a legal separation between them, or indeed political philosophers. And I think to understand the right to have rights, and now this is a truncated version of the argument for which I apologize, it's actually very important to understand ontological alterity. But not in Arendt, but not simply to jump, as many people do in their readings of Arendt and Levinas, from the ontological to the political. It doesn't work that way. You've got to go from the ontological to the agential to pose the question in terms of ethical or political agency, and then to move further into political action. At the core of the sovereignty of citizenship, then, exists the anxiety of the stateless or the refugee. This is the tragic condition of migrants in distress, but is also the human condition of those majorities who, in a twist of historical fate, can themselves become persecuted minorities once they exercise their rights as political dissenters or subaltern activists. It is by recognizing the necessary two-in-one of cultural and political agency that we can avoid the barbarism of the nationalist populism that considers itself as one against all. At the other end, from the consciousness and moral conscience of the two-in-one, is the one against all. So Zasis, which is a coastal town on the Tunisian coast, and it has been a place where a lot of migrants have come because Tunisia has a very long Mediterranean coast. And in Zasis, so a number of corpses, refugee corpses, were beached in Zasis, and the people didn't want to have anything to do with it. They said that these bodies were, the fishermen said, we won't fish the waters because the fish are now contaminated because of the bodies. And he is not satisfied to leave it at that. He says, for me, these corpses are people who have human rights. they should be treated with respect. After all, we never know how our lives can change at some point, and we can become these people. Now, I don't think what Trabelsi is saying is that corpses should be buried with respect. I don't think that he might be saying that too, but that's not his main point. He's saying something which to me seems like an appeal to the future conditional. He is saying something that is very different from the inherentist notion that exists in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which would express itself in a statement like, we don't know what would happen to us, but since we are all endowed with the human dignity, we should easily be able to empathize with others, and we should uphold their rights out of this sense of empathy. There, but for the grace of God, go I. Now, that would be a reading of his statement very much in keeping with the empathic ethics of a document like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. However, in my view, and he's saying something different. Refugee corpses, raised from their rigor mortis by Trabelsi's moral imagination, become specters of an ethical agency that foreshadows the precarious history of the present. These corpses do not only signify the haunting past of refugee drownings. Moving beyond horror and empathy, Trabelsi proposes a more agonistic, if ambiguous, ethical form of identification, based not on the exigencies of the present, but on the contingencies of an ethical and political temporality of the future conditional. After all, he says, we never know how our lives can change at some point, which we never know, and we can become these people. Trabelsi's claims for rights and respect for refugee death exceeds the moral intuition of the Universal Declaration. Trabelsi's claim for rights and respect in extremis is a speech act in the future conditional that intensifies the moral agency and urgency within our own times. At some point in the unknowable future, our rights to citizenship may or may not become so worthless and compromised as to render us unprotected, vulnerable, and homeless. There is no knowing, and since we cannot know at which point we may be in the place of the other, it is this very indeterminacy of time and intention, not its universality, that makes our ethical commitments historically principled, because they are non-contractual, non-instrumental, and non-dogmatic. It's a reversal of the inherentist notion. It's saying because we never know, and because we will never be in that place, that in a future conditional we have to commit ourselves today, because that is the ethical convention. That is the ethical covenant. And of course, I go on to talk now further, which I'm not going to do, about a certain reading of Levinas where he says the whole point of making this ethical connection is because we do not know where we will meet and how we will meet and in what temporality we will have to confront this issue. So I then talk about the law of the sea and how that emphasizes this particular kind of encounter with unknowability. I won't go there, but I'll just end with this little coda. How little they know, those now complicit in the loss of life, writes Goodwin Gill, the leading legal authority on the Refugee Convention, in a rebuke to rational choice policy thinking on deterrence. He gets to the heart of the matter in a remarkable essay on the rights and responsibilities that must be vigilantly protected in principle and procedure in the midst of the migration crisis. And he says, whether we are thinking about sealing borders of the many current lesser policies and practices favored by governments today, whether it's sealing borders or other practices, what we see time and time again is how they fail entirely to understand what it is that drives people knowingly and rationally to risk their own lives and families' lives, going back to the concept of disappointed hope with which I started. How little they know, those now complicit in the loss of life. Only when knowledge and understanding of the despair of others, of their need to survive, and, he says, of their optimism. It's only when you know about that that you can move away from rational choice policies. Of course, he doesn't provide an ethical or theoretical reading. It's only at that point that you need a different ethics. And I align that with my notion of the future conditional. It is because we do not know that we should be both judicially and ethically committed to this condition. It is not because we need to feel that we are alike that we can actually make that connection. Now, this notion, he says, if you think about the other and give it an agential authority to the distressed migrant or subject, who will then not be objectified, but he tries to see the whole notion of protection no longer on the basis of the sovereign state's notions of its own security, but he turns this around. He says the only way to understand how to construct immigration policy is to actually begin to understand what it means to start from the place of death, as indeed Mohammad Trabelsi was arguing in Zarsis. It is only if we take the place of death and if we say, these dead people have human rights, that you can rethink the structure of human rights outside of this inherentist notion of dignity and through the idea of alterity, of the two in one. It is only because we don't know that we can actually begin to construct a moral framework, an ethical framework. Goodwin Gill's appeal to the other in his attempt to reroute migration policy through the negative way in order to achieve a form of ethical and political identification in the future conditional, which is similar to Trabelsi's view. If Trabelsi's others are the corpses of Zarsis, Goodwin Gill's others are those who are dehumanized, turned into objects, as he calls it, if not corpses, and who dwell in the space of the rationality of risk. Risk, not simply as the last act of despair, but as the starting point of practical and conceptual deliberations on refugee and migrant protection. Risk is our recognition of dignity and our attempt to take responsibility for its distress. Taking a risk in this sense is no less an act of dignity in distress, and nobody narrates this better than James Baldwin with his characteristic fortitude in facing a future we may never know, but nonetheless one we cannot live without. For this is your home, my friend. Do not be driven from it. Great men have done great things here and will again, and we can make America what America must become. It will be hard, James, but you come from sturdy stock of men who picked cotton and women who dammed rivers and built railroads, and in the teeth of the most terrifying odds, achieved an unalienable and monumental dignity. To make America or India or Argentina or Brazil what these countries must become is the moral and political antithesis of making them great again. I began these reflections with the purpose of engaging with the terrifying odds of the global barbarisms of tribal nationalism, discrimination and degradation, executed in a politics of miasma. We live in dark times, and yet Mohammad Trabelsi's insistence on the human rights of refugee corpses and Baldwin's conviction that America must become a home for the blacks, however great the ethical risk, these are voices in the company of Arendt that make claims to disappointed hope. I end in the hope that we may find together a human space and a historical time suspended somewhere between disappointment and enchantment. You have been given me hope by listening. I hope I have not disappointed you. Thank you.
Thanks for the talk. Two very short questions. One as regards the transference, specifically when we talk about Levinas from...
I can't hear. What did you say?
Specifically when we talk about Levinas the transference from what he calls the passivity more passive than the dichotomy between passivity and activity to then moral agency, which seems to be a very problematic, tricky thing to achieve. The second one, talking about contingency, because you introduced contingency as the possibility, the potential to achieve something new, right? But then there's another moment of contingency, and that is the waiting at the borders, where you do not know the future, and that makes this contingency so strenuous and experience. So are we talking about two different forms of contingency here?
Yeah, let me take the second question first. Yes, we are talking about two different forms of contingency, but they are related. And they're related through what I call the perplexity of rights. The perplexity of rights relates the two things, and you never know which way it can go, the final judgment or jury. And I think that is something we've got to accept. And that is something we've got to work with as best we can. But there is no, as with contingency more generally, there is no way of predicting how it's in saying, we are here, we are not those people. We don't know when our time will come or if it will not come. You know, we are not here. We don't know. This may never happen. That is the receptacle. That is the reception of the passivity. Then I flip it round to say, unlike the Universal Declaration, where we know that we all are born with dignity, that we know that all our lives are worthwhile, you know, just because it says so. Now I argue that it is based on that negative moment, on that moment of vacancy, as it were, of not knowing, that we build an ethics of agency. It intensifies, as I put it, our action because it is non-contractual, non-instrumental. So I think do you see what I'm saying? There's an argument there by accepting that first moment of, you know, the passivity of first philosophy, then to turn it round. And it seemed to me that that links back to what I was calling the contingencies and indeterminacies of rights. I especially took the concept of the perplexity of rights because I did not want to do what I see happening very often, which is by taking first philosophy or taking the ontological argument and immediately translating it, do you see what I mean, into a kind of political action. That's why I spent some time saying how an agential form develops out of of the paradox that you very acutely represent. Thank you so much for that question. It allowed me to clarify what I had to rush through. Yep.
Thank you so much for this. It was very inspiring, and I think that it also resonates with one of my biggest shames of being French, because if you remember, it was last summer, it was the Aquarius event, and it waited for ages in front of a French harbor before being sent to Italy, I guess, or Malta. And so I was thinking about this perplexity of rights that you mentioned. And my question would be, is there, or can we also say that in that case, because it's not a no man's land, but it's a no man's waters in a way, because it was in an international, in the international waters. Can we also mention a perplexity of duties or of responsibility when it comes to nations that actually failed to offer, to offer shelter to those people?
I think that's a very fine question, and much of my thinking about perplexity, about disappointed hope, about death-life, you know, in the Levinasian metaphor. Much of my thinking about that comes from thinking the question of rights and migration through the expanses of water and what happens on the sea. And here I'd just like to mention the work of Itamar Mann, whose book Humanity at Sea I consider to be a very interesting work. But so in fact, had I read my lecture fully, you would have seen references to it, because in one way, the water is the place where the in-condition, as Levinas puts it, the in-condition of the meeting of the ethical tryst, the inconditionality, when people meet inconditionally. Water is in a way the most dramatic site for that kind of ethical and human rights encounter. And the reasons for this are, of course, many, but we also must take hope from the landmark decision of the European Court. I can never remember the name of the case, but it's a landmark decision when it's not the French, they were very close to that, when a whole group of waterbound or water-based refugees were intercepted by an Italian boat, sent back to Libya. And then, of course, on the one hand, it established the refoulement principle, that you cannot send people back to where they will be endangered. So that was one principle which was then adopted internationally after this case that I forget, not being a lawyer. I remember characters in novels, whereas everybody in this country always remembers a case. Roe versus Wade, Wade versus McCormick, everyone's life is constructed. I can't remember the name of this case. But what interested me even more in that case, what they established, was the fact that you can never return people en masse. It is the duty, since you talk about duty, for each case, in a casuistic way, to be listened to and its claims judged. Now, this is not simply a legal process, I suggest. It is a process by which time is bought. Since I said time was as important as space in these debates, although we tend to talk about it spatially, in which time is bought through the narrative of individual cases, and it muddies the judgment, because cases are not the same. So it's not simply about being against refoulement or refoulement, but it's also how you build up then an archive of deliberation, of ethical and political and judicial deliberation, by having to go from case to case. And if waiting is often a negative thing, I'm suggesting waiting here might be an agential problem. It gives agency to these narratives.
You talked about the language of discrimination and degradation, and I was wondering, how does this, what you call barbaric nationalism, how does this get narrated through platforms like Twitter? Is there any relationship between Twitter as a genre and what we've come to understand the institution of the nation state?
Well, you know, there was an old argument that the form, the cultural form of information that the nation state, that was a mirror of the nation state, was the newspaper. And then, of course, Benedict Anderson also talked about the novelistic narrative. I think, I think forms like Twitter, which are used extensively by Mr. Modi in India and by by President Trump here, provide in a way an infectious illusion of free expression. It's a kind of a mythical idea that this gives you the power to say what you want. This gives you the power to overcome institutions. This gives you a direct voice. I think it's a real perversion of that principle. And as you know, the problem now is people are trying to institutionalize these things and establish a law around them. What can be said, what shouldn't be said, how you can say it, how you can't say it. But I think that the use of Twitter, particularly by tyrannical leaders, become political rationalism, bureaucratic and administrative nationalism, and has squeezed the question of affect out of the question of politics. When Kant talked about public reason, in my view, and I may be wrong here, he was aware that public reason emerged through, as if I remember rightly, through the negotiation of dissent and the conflict of faculties, through the negotiation of dissent. I think where there is an awareness of that, there is also an awareness of affect. I mean, I'm not saying that Kant was the most cuddly character in the world, but I am saying that affect needs to be brought into politics, and it cannot be brought into politics, in my view, simply by mimicking the larger polarizations that exist in politics. Affect cannot simply be brought into view by saying, you know, I feel passionately about being a man of color, and I, in some ways, suspect you because you're a woman without color or of non-color or whatever. These polarizations that are becoming so significant in the language of appropriation and so on are not really places where affect can be negotiated. They are binary structures and polar structures, and what we know about affective politics, whether it is used for bad purposes or good purposes, affective politics is the difficult task of dealing with ambivalence. That's why, to me, Arendt's notions of consciousness or her notions of rights or her notions of ethical judgment cannot be understood without trying to rethink her concept of alterity. Affect is about the presence of ambivalence in the political discourse and of our recognition of it and our attention to it. And that's why I think that Twitter very often allows for no ambivalence, but it allows for the impress of the voice of authority. I'm telling you this. You don't read it in the third person. I'm telling it to you in the first person.
I really like the term that you use, distressed migration, instead of forced migration, since you invoke the prime instrument 1951 convention so often. Tell us a little bit about that choice.
My dear, that choice is not my originally making. This is something used by lawyers nowadays all the time, and it's a very simple thing. It is to forced migration very often falls back on political migration or political or economic. Mm-hmm. And I think distress migration is to get away from that distinction. You know, if you cannot make a living either for reasons to do with climate change or reasons to do with market manipulation or whatever, and you seek a place where you can, does that necessarily make you an economic migrant of grade 2? Whereas if you are being chased by a gang, then that makes you grade 1. So it's, I think, to get rid of that. I use it partly because I'm so keen on bringing in the whole area of time and affect into this debate. And so it seems to me that time, questions of conditionality, distress, despair, affect, are well born by the concept of distress. And I think distress is less judgmental.
So connected is between this never again and the resurgence of the again that you so wonderfully point out. Whatever happened to the audacity of hope? Are you dealing with that in the...
Well, what is disappointed hope if not the audacity of hope? What is the belief in the future conditional as the basis of a right, if not the audacity of hope and also the courage of that audacity?
About your concept of the proleptic perception. So, isn't there something slightly unethical about an ethics that talks about the suffering of the other, giving a voice to it without that self-centeredness of I could be that person too?
Sure, that's exactly what I argued. I argued exactly that if you do it by saying, I must do this because I could be in that position, that's the UN Declaration. That's the moral intuitionism, moral inherentism. I argued precisely the opposite, that the future conditional is that I may well never be in that position. I am not that person.
Okay.
I am not that, but because of that, I am even more committed to taking a stand. That proleptic view, the first view, which you misunderstood, that first view is the aspirational view of the architecture of rights, the aspirational. There's nothing wrong with it. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. It's much better than saying, I don't give a shit. I don't give a shit is like not good. But like saying, this is like, this could be my brother, my sister, let me dive in and do some things. It's certainly better than that. But the proleptic, or what I'm calling the unconditional, or the inconditionality, as Levinas calls it, as the basis of an agency to think about rights, both the ethics of rights and the organization of rights, is proleptic rather than simply aspirational.
Thank you. I must have confused your emphasis. My bad.
I have spoken very badly. I apologize to you.
I was thinking about your argument about the relationship between alterity and contingency, and I was it was so suggestive to me, and it's partly because on the one hand we think of contingency as a temporal structure and alterity as a spatial structure, but it also made me think about the subjunctive that you're proposing to us, the acting as if, and what's almost a kind of negative subjunctive,
yes,
right?
Absolutely.
The acting as if it's not.
Yes,
or
absolutely.
And the clarity challenges us to create a acting for on the basis not of the possibility of sameness, but on the possibility of never reaching some sense of sameness.
Absolutely.
But it's also suggests to us, and I think this was the point that I really took, that solidarity requires a kind of futuristic or proleptic, as you say, imagination, in a way that sympathy is actually modeled on a kind of stasis and retrospection. And in that sense, sympathy becomes attached to the again in a way that solidarity is actually structured by the subjunctive. And so I just wanted to throw that out there because I was trying to think about how we put these two spatial temporal pieces together.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And I think you've got the narrative that I think that's just what I was arguing. Let me just say one thing, which is just to mess a little bit with the spatiality of alterity.
Okay.
Where I would suggest to you that the model of alterity, this is why I've been confusing the spatial and the temporal. I've been confusing the origination of natural rights or human rights with citizenship rights, which is a much more diachronic. I've been particularly confusing these things because I believe that alterity is not only simply about the two in one. It is through the two in oneness to then return to something else, to an in-betweenness. You see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. It's what it emphasizes, not just the two in one. it emphasizes that when you insert, that's why I emphasize the insertion of the two in one. That act of insertion is also an act of temporal displacement. You see what I'm saying?
I do.
And it's important for that. You made me think of something, which is that when Arendt talks about, in the longer version, in the chapter I had this, when she talks about alterity, she says, alterity depends on your come back to yourself. She said, when you come home, there is your close friend who's also your worst friend waiting for you. When you come home, so, you know,
Different kind of return.
so it's a totally different kind of return. That's why I said alterity has within it its own kind of iterative displacement. And it is that point of return that creates the solidarity. Thank you.